Welcome to the conversation. I'm Kwame Thomas. Tonight, we assess the Caribbean's place in a rapidly evolving world order. With Donald Trump's return to the Oval Office for a second term, his America First doctrine is once again reshaping foreign policy. What does that mean for small states like ours, economically, diplomatically, and socially? I'm joined by two expert voices, economist Dr. Samuel Brathwaite and political psychologist Dr. Christopher Charles. Together, we'll explore the implications of Trump's return for the Caribbean and beyond. Stay tuned after these messages. Trump's back in the office. The rhetoric is familiar, and so are the risks. In this segment, we unpack how a second Trump presidency doubles down on unilateralism, disrupts foreign aid flows, and forces Caribbean nations to choose between loyalty and leverage. Gentlemen, welcome to the conversation. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
So, we have seen a number of things now. Now that we have President Trump back in the office for a second term, you know, there are a number of things, as you would have seen here, that have come before us. And what I want to ask first, though, I think I'll go to just Dr. Sam. How is this shift towards transactionalism impacting economies in the region, especially those who are heavily reliant on U.S. aid and trade?
For me, the first and major concern at this time is not the specific policy initiative. So, for example, the one thing which has dominated the news for the past week has been this issue of tariffs. But in and of themselves, the issue is not the tariff per se, but just the uncertainty surrounding them. First of all, we had a highly flawed formula, a formula for which not even a fourth farmer would have written. And I kid you not, it is a nonsensical thing, yes? So it is that uncertainty which I think is of greater worry to us. Why do I say that? If you think about the American economy, we see where the stock market is fluctuating up and down. People are not confident as they were maybe a few weeks ago, yes? So that uncertainty could very well lead to problems in terms of our tourism sector, for example, or the amount of remittances that people send to Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean, yes? But again, there's still time for us to see how things pan out when it comes to those tariffs. And in fact, I've often said that we need to approach it with a certain calm, not to go on television and say, you know, we're going to retaliate or anything like that. And we've seen this week for countries which take that sort of position, Donald Trump is doubling down on what he's saying, you know?
Yeah, so what I'm thinking though, you know, over to you, Dr. Charles. So we see where the U.S. is moving away from multilateralism towards bilateralism, you know, and these deals are reshaping how Caribbean nations are able to...
Bilateralism or unilateralism?
Well, one-on-one, unilateral for the most part, but you know, we're seeing how these deals though are shaping how we negotiate as a region, you know. So the question now, how should we're caught between loyalty and leverage, obviously. You know, are you of the opinion that Trump's unilateralism may erode Caribbean trust in the U.S. as far as diplomacy is concerned?
No, I don't think it's a matter of trust. It's a matter of survival. And just given our vulnerabilities as small political units, as small states, we're going to try and find a way, as we have always done, to work with the giant, what I'm calling now the big bully to the north. So it's not so much trust. It's how do we speak with one voice in CARICOM? How do we approach the United States in a manner where it can be a win-win for both the United States and CARICOM, the Caribbean community, And I'm saying this because elsewhere, I gave an interview where I expected for example, on the Cuban medical mission, that our government in Jamaica would break ranks with CARICOM with regards to the Cuban medical mission and end the program. So far, we have not seen that. CARICOM, we have spoken with one voice. I'm still very suspicious and still looking, but I must say that at least the little we have seen and heard about it, it appears that we have spoken with one voice with regards to that. So that is very good. So it's a matter of trying to explain to our North American partner, the United States, that some of these issues are matters of survival and we need to hold on to them. For example, the Cuban medical mission and maintaining diplomatic relations with Cuba.
Are there any spaces though for what we can call new alliances to emerge from this particular situation?
Well, it's not so much new, but reinforcing. We have always had a relationship with China, especially in the last 20 years. Chinese, they have built infrastructure in Africa and the Caribbean. They have built medical school, they have built roads, bridges. They have done so much in the global south. So it's just a matter of finding a way to reinforce those arrangements with China without offending the United States. And that's very difficult because of how the elite in the United States see China. China is a threat. Mm-hmm. Right? So while we can negotiate with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and we can keep dealing with Cuba, I'm waiting to see how, when the trade war really heats up, what will happen, how we will negotiate that. But there are benefits to be had from our relations with China, and so we have to plan a strategy that we can still benefit from China's infrastructure and development foreign policy. I'm calling it that, without offending the United States.
So right now we're seeing, well, the Secretary of State, he made a statement. You know, the U.S. government is no longer playing global parent. That's one, and he clarified that by saying that the U.S. government is not a charity. Remember that statement that was being made. Now, one of the things that I want us to clarify here is, we look at Trump era foreign policy and we see where it has introduced to some extent a trust deficit. You might not see it that particular way, but that seemingly is the direction in which it's pointing. So traditional alliances are being undermined, you know, based on even your own statements, and smaller nations are forced to recalibrate. You know, we can always pull that. You know, I'll ask you first, Dr. Brathwaite, are we seeing efforts towards economic diversification, you know, as a response to that? You know, that's the first question. You know, probably have two.
For me, I think efforts have been made going back to the COVID-19 crisis. Mm-hmm. I think the disruption that caused already placed countries in a position where they had to start looking for alternatives. We hear the term nearshoring as a buzzword. And here is a number that people don't often mention. If you look between 2018 and 2023, America's imports from China actually fell by 20%. You don't hear that word, that number in the news, yes? So things are already happening, but not all of them have been communicated or communicated loudly enough. You see, if we look at this current tariff crisis, if you want to call it that, every serious business person who engages in international trade knew something was coming and would have made moves. Of course, they could not have seen that crazy formula we saw last week, but they knew something was coming, and so they were making moves. So I have no doubt that you look across the world, coming out of COVID, and countries were looking to see what moves they can make to build out or diversify their trading relationships and the like.
So, Dr. Charles, in light of this particular pivot in terms of foreign policy, American foreign policy and foreign relations, how do you think it's being interpreted throughout the region now? Yes, we know that we have to figure out from a Jamaican perspective how we handle the giant, but right throughout the region, what do you think, how do you think it's being interpreted as we go into the break?
That it's a new world and we have to diversify in terms of find more trading partners, diversify our economies, and use the leverage. And what leverage means in the traditional sense is that you do have Russia, you do have China, and all these major players still want small states, still wants to have dealing with small states. So leverage says that you can play off one major power against another by saying what each is offering. And then when they know what each is offering, the one who comes with the best offer for you, you take it. So that was used before during the Cold War. The context is different now, but we can see in the Eastern Caribbean in terms of how the smaller Caribbean states, because we're all small states in the Caribbean, these smaller Caribbean states in the Eastern Caribbean, how they play off Taiwan against China. They'll go to China and say, Taiwan has offered this. They go to Taiwan and say, China has offered this. And then they get what they want.
So you think that we're in a position to do that now, that the larger Caribbean states?
Yes, all Caribbean states.
But we just need to do that as one voice, though.
Yes.
But outside of one voice, we also have, as small as our countries are, or individual countries are, we have one vote in certain international organizations. Yes.
So therefore, there's still space for us to use the leverage.
We do.
All right. I just want to remind you that you are watching The Conversation. I'm speaking with economist from the University of the West Indies as well as a political psychologist from same institution in the persons of Dr. Christopher Charles and Samuel Brathwaite. Continue to watch us. You're watching The Conversation. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to The Conversation. From DACA rollbacks to visa restrictions, Trump's immigration policies sent shockwaves through diaspora communities. But what about back home? That's pretty much what we want to find out. The mass deportation, the threats to DACA or from DACA, and the family separations that have been framing the immigration policies under Trump. What is the goal, though? You know, the statement has been made that it's to restore law and order, but what, in your opinions?
Well, I'm best placed to speak for a number of reasons. I'm not a holder of a green card or a visa, so there's none to be taken away. But I have other protections, by the way. So I'm the one who normally speaks on these issues. The slogan to make America great again is really to make America white again. If you look at the deportations, they're not, you'll find other occasions where they send a journalist back to France because he might have had an anti-Trump statement on his phone. And you will find these occasions, but largely it's mostly non-white people that are being denied entry and are being deported. There are no mass deportations to Germany, to Canada, to the UK, to France. It's to Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, Latin America.
Could the argument, though, be posed that it's primarily because these are countries that are relatively poorer, you know, and so you have more persons leaving those countries and going to American shores for a better life? Could it be framed that way?
Europeans have always been coming to America for a better life. But they are invisible because we don't talk about them. The fact that you're asking or making that statement is evidence of the point I'm making, that immigration is usually people from the global south issue. There are people from the global north who are there and they're not being harassed.
So
ICE doesn't stop any white person on the street, you know. They're all non-white people. If they do it, that hardly happens.
hardly happen. So what are some of the psychological and social tolls, though, that these immigration policies might have on Caribbean people, particularly, and the families in the U.S.?
Fear, real fear, stress, anxiety. People, you know, plan to come home, they can't take it, crying, the stress of not being able to move about to make as much money to send to the Caribbean. So in my many sojourn in the United States, because I live between Jamaica and the US. So just to give an example, I went to some Caribbean spots in December and I left in January and I went back in February and those spots were closed. I didn't know, and my childhood friends who I hang with were laughing because I didn't know that we were among so many illegal immigrants. And so social life is gone, right? People are literally hiding, and we know that social isolation takes a toll, as the pandemic reminded us. So one, the hiding and the uncertainty, not wanting to return, that's stress and anxiety. If you're ill, you can't go to the doctor. You have to hide because ICE is all around, moving up and down, doing all kind of spot checks. You can't make enough money to send to your relatives, and so on. And at least for the next 4 years, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to regularize your status if you're an illegal immigrant. So the toll is great psychologically.
So we see, you know, tighter immigration rules and how those have led to reduced remittances, you know, and it's directly impacting Caribbean economies, you know, and household resilience. So Dr. Brathwaite, walk us through how are remittances or how are remittance-dependent economies in the region being impacted by the Trump administration's anti-immigration, you know, stance?
At this time, I don't think it has hit us yet. It's not that I know of.
So the worst is yet to come.
I hope not, you know. We're a resilient people. Like I said, it's still early days yet. For example, you know, I follow the Jamaican exchange rate quite regularly, almost every day. Just a few days ago, I saw it inching up, you know, a little bit above 158 or what have you. And I thought to myself, if this keeps up, we're going to see an intervention into the market. And yesterday, or is it the day before, $30 million was dropped into the foreign exchange market, you see? So there might be some movement happening, but I cannot speak to any particular scenario where, you know, there is that. But again, if this uncertainty keeps up, if within the next month or two, you know, there's no resolution between China and the United States to calm this craziness down, we might very well start to see effects as early as the summer, you know, in terms of remittances and people traveling and the like.
So, Dr. Charles, we looked at the policies, we spoke about them and said they have created or they have been creating some amount of anxiety and dislocation among the diaspora, you know, and they're contributing somewhat to a kind of social displacement, admittedly. What are some of the narratives that have emerged within the diaspora community? Is it resilience or is it resignation?
Well, in the Jamaican sense, people start saying nowhere better than yard. Nowhere is better than home. so there is that. We're little but we're taller.
Yeah.
We're not rich, but at least I'll have social dignity, despite the problems that we complain about. For Caribbean people generally, and Jamaicans in particular, the region is now more attractive than before because of the risk. Because there are a lot of people who did not want to become Americans and they would have their green cards or permanent resident status, permanent resident card, and so on. Or they might be working on that special visa where if you're you have a special skill, you can be employed to work in the U.S. So these people now are suddenly at risk. And so the other parts of the world, Europe, Canada, Africa, Asia, they are now becoming more attractive to these professionals in terms of where the alternatives are. And but for Caribbean people, the migrants, those who are not very skilled, it's worry, it's anxiety, and they're hedging their bets and they're trying to figure out, should I stay or should I return home? Even those who have legal status, just given how difficult it is now or sticky, so to speak, for those who have green cards. You can still be deported for any flimsy reason.
All right, so I'm sensing in the conversation something about brain drain, because we have always had an issue in the Caribbean with brain drain. It has deepened, and to some extent, as the mobility has been restricted now, there's a question on everybody's lips. What does that mean for Caribbean development? So how could these policies, Dr. Brathwaite, help to shape long-term planning for economic resilience, especially in the sending countries? So US, and on one end, but for the Caribbean nations here, who a good swath of those who have graduated from tertiary level institutions, they are going abroad. How might these policies change now their stance and the country in terms of how we position ourselves?
Well, while it is the case that the numbers going to the United States may very well fall, either because of immigration policy or because of, Caribbean people being scared to go into that space. But here's the thing. Caribbean folks have always traveled, right? And always migrated. That's part of Caribbean life. So if it's not the United States, it's going to be Canada.
Or it's going
to be Europe. It's going to be the UK, you see? So that is not going to stop. What our governments have to do is, as best as possible, to make life in the Caribbean as best as possible for its citizens. So when we think of education, you want to be able to educate your people as best as possible. And by this, I don't mean, okay, people just go to school for X number of years. It is about the quality of education that is received. You see? So we have to look long and hard at, the subjects that our students are doing, as an example. But in terms of migration, we can't stop that. That's going to happen. As long as there are disparities in wages and so on, Caribbean people will travel, they will look for a better life. It might be going to China too.
China.
Don't be surprised.
Don't be surprised.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. There's a lot for us to consider as far as that is concerned, because with the anxiety and all of those things, one would make the assumption that somehow this might put a stop or put some amount of hindrance on the need for us to go away. Because some persons in the Caribbean have wanderlust. There's going to be that need to go abroad and experience what's out there. But we continue. Just want to remind you that you're watching the conversation and we are about to go to a break. Continue to stay with us. We'll be right back. You sound hollow and tinny. But, you're sounding better. You sound like you're in water, but you sound better. You can go and talk. We're good. All right. In seeking to push the region away from Venezuela, did Trump's America First strategy push us towards China? And what has that meant for development and diplomacy? So you heard it here, and the question that I want to ask is, how has this push, this affect energy security and pricing strategies throughout the region that push from Petrocaribe towards other forms of energy or sourcing of energy?
Excellent question. Now, I think when we look at the energy market, yes, and we talk about Venezuela in particular, we have to recognize that in the case of, say, the Trump administration, there are no permanent friends, you know, as has been often said. We have to recognize that Venezuela, yes, still has the world's largest deposits of crude, about 300 billion barrels. Yes? So the pushback we see against Venezuela is really bullying. It's just about dominance. Because in the Biden years, we saw where there was a cooling of the relationship with the Venezuelans. Now that Trump is back in office, we see where that is disrupted again. And it has implications for our Caribbean sister nation, Trinidad and Tobago. Just a few days ago, we saw where the Dragon Field gas project, the rug was pulled on that. Yes? But the other thing is, if you look at the energy markets again, we see where there is a move towards renewables. Yes? So one doesn't expect that energy prices are going to be crossing over into the $100 mark or what have you. And so, in fact, when we look back at Petrocaribe, it came in at a time when, you know, energy prices were going, you know, beyond $100 and what have you, you see? So, and of course, if we look at the uncertainty happening now, globally, in terms of trade, that can have a dampening effect on the price for energy, you see? So I wouldn't say that it's an area, you know, in terms of pricing and so on, it's an area for concern. And of course, too, as small states, you know, we have to be very careful. You know, we can't push back too much. We understand what Trump is doing. And like I said, he doesn't have permanent friends. His art of the deal is to bully countries to come and sit at the table and to have a discussion so that he can extract as much for himself. What we are seeing recently, if you look at all the tit-for-tat between the United States and China in recent days, what the Chinese are saying is that, look, we understand what you're doing regarding the art of the deal, and we too want to extract concessions from you.
So we see that on one hand, as far from a Caribbean perspective, no, China is stepping in, and they have stepped in with infrastructure investments. We have seen roads, ports, ICT, and all these have been framed as part of
the Belt and Road.
So solidarity vision. So the question now, how should we assess the economic value of Chinese investments versus the strategic risks?
You know, countries in the Caribbean, if we go back 4 decades or so, took a non-alignment position, you know. I do think that at this time, we need to reboot that idea of non-alignment. Yes? So we engage with the United States, we engage with China. And in those engagements, we do what is best for our region. And I say our region because we don't have much by way of human resources in individual countries to deal with the several issues that are in front of us. So the CARICOM project is a project which can help us as a region to deal with these issues, but it has to be one, in my view, of non-alignment. And so, for example, in recent times we hear about boycotting the United States, boycotting US products. We have to recognize that we are not so much fighting America per se, you know. We're not fighting the American consumer or the American producer. The fight is against an administration that has little idea as to how economics and how trade works, you see? And so we have to be in solidarity with the American producer and the American consumer, even if they voted for Trump. because some of them are having buyer's remorse as we speak.
So, question to you now. I'm looking at China's rhetoric, and that's being focusing on mutual benefits and equality, and this is a language that stands in contrast to the US's more dominant tone. So, question to you now, Dr. Charles, what are the possible Caribbean public responses to China's language of equality and mutual respect?
We, as Caribbean states, we have to calmly and respectfully state our right to self-determination and our right to sovereignty, bearing in mind that as small states, we are a friend to all and enemy to none. And so we'll maintain good relations with all our partners and our neighbors in the Caribbean, in particular the United States and Cuba. And so we have to follow what we have done since we got independence at different times between 1962 onwards. We, as small states, we follow the principle of international law. What we did, we ensured that we were on the side of right when it comes to national and regional foreign policy. I always give my favorite example, apartheid in South Africa. We spoke with one voice. And there are a range of other issues on which we spoke with one voice. And so we should go back there as a region and also find that wiggle room diplomatically where if we're under pressure from, for example, the United States, to show how we can align our interests with theirs, where we come out win-win. So in the negotiation, where you end up with the United States, it becomes a win-win situation. And that takes understanding and negotiation skills. You have to have technical experts with negotiating skills and the country experts, and who also have the diplomatic skills to guide the foreign affairs ministers and the prime ministers in the region. But it can be achieved.
So we see where the Caribbean, so to speak, is increasingly caught in what we can call a strategic triangle. So we see balancing pressure, U.S. pressure with China's expanding presence now. And so, Dr. Brathwaite, are the Caribbean leaders able to balance the relationship with both superpowers? You think that's possible here and now?
I do think it is possible, you know. And one of the things that we can do, I don't want to call any particular leader here, yes? But sometimes no response is the best response. Because once you say it, you can't pull it back, you know. So unless something rises to the level where you have to respond, you know, address the nation or what have you, you can keep quiet. Because what we have to recognize, you know, what we see on TV is not all that is happening, you know. Behind the scenes, there are trade specialists or diplomats who are running around making deals and doing things that we never hear about unless, you know, maybe 5 years down the line you're able to access a document and you say, this was happening behind the scenes, you see. So we might see, you know, leaders not saying anything, but rest assured that their technocrats are working behind the scenes. And so there's hope there, I do think. Even now in terms of all this confusing situation with these so-called reciprocal tariffs. And I do mean so-called reciprocal tariffs because they're far from that, yes? I do believe that our regional trade specialists are engaging with their colleagues in the United States and trying to gain clarity on what is happening. So I do believe that, yes, we can deal with these powerful nations in a very calm, objective way.
So, Dr. Charles, as we go into the break now, tell us about this dynamic shift. I want to find out whether or not these dynamics signal what we can call a broader shift in regional ideological alignments now.
When you say regional ideological alignments, what do you mean?
So we have the global south, yes, we're a region by ourselves, the CARICOM, Caribbean, and we look at U.S. foreign policy, we look at China, we look at all of what we're now left to navigate and balance. Do we know, should we be looking along the lines, or this situation, rather, does it signal any form of shift in terms of being aligned to any particular ideology outside of what obtains?
Well, there's only one ideology that obtains now. It's capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So look in the global south in terms of what my public administration teachers at the University of the West Indies would say, the international technical bureaucracies, like, for example, the IMF, they've largely dictated what goes on in the economies of the Caribbean, Africa, and so on. So that's the ideology. And this is not a matter of ideology, what is happening. It's a matter of the United States. In one particular, well, one half of the elite, at least leader for now, have a particular view of the world that is causing the realignments. Is there a long game that all these things will continue? I can't say, but what I do know, it's best for the Caribbean to think about the long game and what we need to do. So it's not so much an ideological alignment, but an alignment with states that meets our national interests. And the United States, despite how it's acting now, we still have to extract benefits from the relationship we have with the United States, just given the nature of the economy, how powerful it is, and it controls this region, and it's our largest market for CARICOM states. But we also need infrastructure. We also need the Chinese. We also need health professionals. We also need medical personnel from Cuba. We also need cheaper energy sources. So there is Venezuela. How can we find a way to deal with the Americans to say, we need this, we are going to negotiate under these conditions. If you don't want to negotiate to get this, this energy deal, provide us with an alternative and fund that alternative in terms of energy.
So in a sense then, as we go into the break then, what we're pretty much saying that this is by no means a sprint. This is definitely a marathon.
Yes.
Definitely a marathon. Just want to remind you that you're watching The Conversation, where I'm speaking with Dr. Samuel Brathwaite and Dr. Christopher Charles, both from the University of the West Indies. Continue to stay with us. We'll be right back after these messages. Tariffs, climate denial, and a fractured global order. How are we in the Caribbean still feeling the tremors of Trump's America First agenda? So this is something for us to consider. The climate is changing, tariffs are rising, and small nations are pretty much paying the price. What are some of the economic consequences of Trump's climate and tariff policies on the small island states such as ours?
Where I want to start with that question is to go back to the Biden administration. And I want to mention a term which became, it was always there, but it became popular again. And that term is industrial policy, where a government decides that, look, they want to push the expansion of certain sectors in an economy. Yes? So one of the things the Biden administration would have done was to focus on green technologies. Yes? That was the industrial policy that his administration was going after. Worryingly, and perhaps interestingly, we see a continuation of this idea of industrial policy by the Trump administration. Yes? And I make this point because I don't think very many people are upset with Trump wanting to make America great again, you know. The concern a lot of economists have is the way in which it's done. So what is the connection between industrial policy and tariff policy and climate change? Well, what Trump is doing essentially is by putting tariffs on products coming from various countries, he is hoping that in so doing, it reduces the demand for these imports by Americans. And so Americans then will then move towards purchasing American-made products. That is his hope, you see? But Americans can only purchase American products if the products are made there.
And there's a competitive.
There you go. And if they can compete on price, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes? So that's the first place to start. One industrial policy being replaced with another type of industrial policy. See? What does that have to do with us here in the Caribbean? We in the Caribbean also want to engage in policies which can lead towards what we call climate mitigation things, right? So, for example, you know, moving towards renewable energy, right? Now, because we're so small and highly open, we are dependent, we have always been dependent on international trade. If you look at the numbers for the United States, just to give you an example, when you look at total trade, exports and imports of goods and services, it amounts to about 25% of American GDP, the American economy. You look at Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, that number is upwards of 70, 80%. Germany too, the number is high. Yes?
Yeah.
And because it's high, it means, the higher it is, it means your country is more open. This is not a bad thing per se, because one of the questions we ask in economics is how can trade promote economic growth and development? And the way in which it is done is through the transferring of technologies. But if you have an administration in the United States which is pushing back against efforts to fight climate change, then how can we benefit from that? Right? So I'm not saying we can't look elsewhere, but as our main trading partner, a partner for which we already have deep connections, yes, it would be good if they too were going in that direction. This doesn't mean, of course, we can't look to China for solar panels and batteries and what have you, and EVs, you know.
So we hear about the trade wars. We've experienced the trade wars to some extent and the protectionist tariffs, and we have seen how those have disrupted the global markets and they have exposed the fragility of our external dependencies, though. How does this shape Caribbean attitudes now towards international environmental cooperation, Dr. Charles?
Well, I can be particular and say we need international climate participation, or international participation and cooperation about climate. So the Trump administration they're not climate deniers. They're not anti-climate. They experience weather and climate.
Yeah, but they're downplaying the vulnerability.
No, let me just say, get through the thought, and then you'll better see the connections. They're not climate deniers. They're anti-science. So what they're pushing against rather, is the scientific evidence that supports the position of the left about climate change. But climate is real, and they know this. So I'm happy you mentioned international cooperation or participation, because walking away from the Trump administration, one of his first executive orders was to walk away from the Paris Agreement.
Yes.
And we know the impact of greenhouse gases on global warming. The evidence is irrefutable, right? And it's not that they don't believe it, but their funders make money by increasing global warming and destroying the ozone layer.
Ah.
So we are small states. Global warming increases sea level rise. So I was a geography major, so I was raised on this as a geography major as an undergraduate. So global warming increases sea level rise, and we are a small state.
Yeah.
And the more sea level rise, it damages the corals, it warms
beaches,
and so on, destroys tourism. And over time, if we don't manage climate properly and do the things that we need to do, we'll all be underwater in generations to come. So our very survival depends on cooperation and sensible international agreement about climate, just given our small size as island states. And we are, as some of my North American friends would say, beach people, because they all think we go to school or work on the beach.
Just one big beach.
Yes, that's there. But the thought, though, is that we are small, and we need to take and to find ways to see how best we can speak to the United States, or find ways to cooperate on mitigating climate change, because it's our survival.
So we see now China, in contrast, admittedly, has been positioning itself as what you can call a champion for green development, you know, and there's investment in renewables, you know, and there are a whole heap of projects that are going on.
Do you believe that,
you know,
do you know, look at the pollution in the major cities, Beijing, Shanghai?
Well, perhaps they're reeling back from that. So because these things have happened, let us try this particular approach. You know, so the question now is whether or not China has made credible offers in the green energy space. I'll throw that to the economist first and then come back to you. You know,
I don't have a good answer for that. I must admit, I don't know. I don't know that they have. But what I do know, when I look around Jamaica, I see increasingly, you know,
solar.
Chinese cars coming in, and of course, in terms of the use of solar panels, that has been happening now for the better part of a decade or more, and we see where government policy is also encouraging the use of solar energy. You see.
So. Dr. Charles, they're based on what you have just said, you know, because we're near to the end, many in the Caribbean we're asking the question, who will support us when climate disaster strikes, and on what terms will they support us? All right. Do you think that Caribbean citizens see China as a more reliable partner in its sustainable efforts?
I would say that.
Irrespective of Beijing and Shanghai?
They have delivered in terms of what they say they want to do. And of course, there are benefits. And there's a notion that the Chinese will loan you money and enter into all kinds of arrangements, and when you can't pay, they take over your stuff. It's not that easy. States allow them, states who can't pay, turn over the thing. States could default. But they choose not to. So it's not that the Chinese rushing with the Red Army to get this thing done. You know, so the notion from Rubio that they have this strategy that, you know, they will fund things in your country, and when you can't pay, they're just rolling and take it over. That's not true.
Anything to drop on that?
Yeah, just to say I totally agree. You know, very often, I'll give you an example. There's a country which will remain nameless. The Chinese constructed a quite large building for the government. And the building was built back to front.
Yeah.
So what should be the front was the back, right? Who are we going to blame for that? Are we going to blame the Chinese that they weren't doing what they're doing? No. And we see and we hear stories all the time of the Chinese built that and they didn't do a good job. But are we providing proper oversight? You know, are we managing things properly when we engage with the Chinese? So I agree with Prof on that.
So it's more about cooperation and oversight.
Yeah, and how we deal with them. And that is why, as I said earlier, I do recognize that in the Caribbean, we have a human resource deficit, yes? But as a region, if we pool our resources as we have in several different spheres, you know, we're talking about in the tourism sector, you look at agriculture, you know. So within the CARICOM structure, there's so many initiatives for regional cooperation, which you don't hear about readily, you know. We need to look to those things and to strengthen those mechanisms as we deal with China and the United States.
Yeah.
And Europe too. We haven't said much of Europe, you know. Europe still has a deep role to play, especially given that the United States seems to want to abdicate its responsibility in several spheres of international cooperation. And by the way, I am not knocking the Trump administration for dialing back their involvement in, you know, I mean, look, you go back to the Second World War, and America has done quite a lot. You talk about the creation of the IMF, the World Bank, and there was to be an international trade organization which didn't come to fruition. But then 30 years ago, we saw the creation of the WTO, right? I don't necessarily agree with how things are being done in terms of dialing back its leadership role, but we must recognize that, yes, other spaces, other countries need to step up.
Gentlemen, we have discussed a lot. Tonight we have explored where the Caribbean fits in a world of wars and shifting alliances. And so, Dr. Brathwaite, Dr. Charles, I'm going to take this opportunity to thank you, you know, for taking the time out to sit and have this discussion. And for those of you here now, we understand that there's a world, we're in a world of transactional power and their rising tides. Whether it's Washington or Beijing, our future must be carved on our own terms. I'm Kwame Thomas, and this has been The Conversation. Do have yourselves a wonderful rest of the evening.